thank you everybody for jumping in and joining for episode 4 of Journey to Sovereignty. Really excited to jump into this one. And there's been a lot of chatter lately on Twitter going back and forth about the benefits and trade-offs of secure elements. But I wanted a chance for us to dive into the topic in a more nuanced manner than 240 characters allow, because the downside of Twitter is that the nuance usually goes by the wayside. So we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into what secure elements are, what we use them for, and what benefits and trade-offs come with using them to help us secure our Bitcoin. As always, I'm joined by Bitcoin Q&A, Head of Customer Experience here at Foundation, and our CEO and co-founder, Zach Herbert. But for today, we're also joined by Ken, our CTO, to jump in with some of his technical expertise on secure elements. How's it going, guys?
Doing pretty well, Seth. Thank you. Pleasure to be on.
Yeah, going great.
Awesome. Good to have you all, and good to have a little bit bigger crowd than normal here. So one quick reminder before we get rolling, we will have Q&A time at the end, like always. So for those of you in the audience, definitely get those questions ready, and we'll roll with those after. So to start, we briefly touched on secure elements last week. So I know that we've gotten into it a little bit, but I want to circle back to that for those who maybe missed that episode, or to give us a chance to dive into it a little bit more. But what's a secure element in the first place, and what are they chiefly useful for?
Yeah, I guess I can kick us off and then see where everyone else wants to fill in the gaps. Secure element is really a dedicated chip that has or that offers better security, which sounds kind of obvious. But the benefit of this is that in order to access data that's stored on a secure element chip, it can be very, very difficult. They're designed to make it impossible to access any data on it without knowing, the encryption key or a PIN or something like that. But in reality, what it just means, since no chip is perfect, is that it makes it very, very difficult for an attacker to access data. The way I look at secure elements is that they offer really great physical security to a device. So if you have a device that uses a secure element, you almost always would need some kind of physical access and more sophisticated approaches in order to break into the chip and pull off any, private keys or any other important data that's stored on there.
Yeah, I think Zach sort of nailed the core use case there. I think just to pad it out a little bit more, I guess, just to hone in on the sort of the specific nature of these chips, and the fact that it's not sort of you can't just sort of go ahead and install your own kind of application or software on top of this. They have a very specific and narrow set of use cases designed at storing and protecting specific types of data under specific access requirements. So it's not like to be looked at as a traditional sort of standard computer chip that you can kind of program or use at will. It's very focused and kind of like a bit of a one-trick pony that's has one purpose, and that's to be super, super secure.
I would actually add a little more nuance to that Q&A, because I think what you said is how we at Foundation use a secure element with Passport. And it's also how Bitbox and Coldcard use secure elements, but it's not how Ledger does. So Ledger actually runs an entire proprietary operating system on theirs. So I actually do think that the term secure element is kind of broad. It's kind of like a broad category of security chips. And there's another category that's kind of tangential called secure enclaves. And a secure enclave is what you'd find on like your, iPhone or your Pixel phone, for example, or, later, more current Android devices like from Samsung, where secure enclave is actually a secure part of the main processor. It's all on the same chip. And the secure element can be broadly defined as any kind of chip that is tailored towards security. Other examples of hardware wallets that actually run the whole operating system on the secure element are, I think Keystone does the same thing. So even within the hardware wallet world, there's a lot of different ways that these chips are actually used.
one small caveat to that is that Google Pixels are actually the distinction there. So they're actually not secure enclaves, but they do have their own custom built secure element that's a completely separate processor, memory, everything from the main processor itself. And that's one of the interesting things is that secure elements are obviously not invented for Bitcoin usage. Like they've been made for other things and used in server processors and server processing and in mobile phones for a long time. They're used for financial data and secrets by both Google and Apple. So they're certainly not something that's new to the space, but they've been implemented in things like Pixels and in iPhones. I think it's interesting to see that this use case is broader than Bitcoin, and they're not something that's built specifically for Bitcoin keys, but they are used by that for us in the space now.
Yeah, this also uses in the payment industry, and also they're used in supply chain to verify authenticity of certain components.
Yeah, I think fun fact, but I'm pretty sure the 608 series that we use and Bitbox and Cold Card also use is very popular in printer cartridges to make sure that the printer, basically restricts it to only being able to use like a properly, certified cartridge from the manufacturer, because you can get secure elements that are more expensive that run entire operating systems, as we've noted, but you can also get very cheap, simple ones like what we use and what some of the other hardware wallet manufacturers use. And I believe during the supply chain crisis over the last couple years, at least one of the printer manufacturers disabled the need for the secure element because it was impossible to get them, and so and they were able to still sell cartridges without them. So just really interesting to think about how these little chips are actually very broadly used, even in products that are more mundane. And as Ken said, there's definitely a pretty widespread use case in supply chains and supply chain integrity and that kind of stuff.
It's a little funny, though, that in that use case, they're sort of restricting your sovereignty, whereas in our case, we're trying to improve it.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things with secure elements being not exclusively built and used for Bitcoin hardware wallets is that it lessens the risk of kind of a targeted attack. Because I think one of the questions or concerns that I often get with secure elements is that people are concerned that this black box is storing private keys, and so then a manufacturer will implement some sort of malicious backdoor into a secure element to get people's private keys. But these things are we are a very, very, very small percentage of the usage of secure elements worldwide. So it's not something where if a manufacturer did that, they'd also be backdooring all of their large businesses that are using their devices. They'd be impacting a much larger swath of the space and putting their own reputation at risk to do that if they were specifically after Bitcoin private keys. So I think that's one of the things that's helpful to understand, that it's not just Bitcoin hardware wallets that use secure elements. So there's a much broader space there.
I think you make a really good point, which is we're kind of we're a small industry compared to the number of simple secure element chips that are sold per year. I mean, to put one in every printer cartridge, I mean, you're talking probably hundreds of millions of these chips per year, if not billions. And our entire industry probably represents a few million per year at the most. They're very commodity. And they're very cheap, or they can be very cheap. So the one that we use in Passport costs like $1. And that's in, relatively small quantities compared to if you were like HP buying 100 million of these each year. I'm sure you would be able to get it down by the price down significantly. So I think Seth will probably have a chance today to talk about all the different kinds of potential attack vectors and security risks and trade-offs when we consider when we talk about secure elements.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the biggest one that often people are concerned with when we talk about secure elements is the fact that they're a black box, they're closed source. No one knows exactly how they work outside of what the manufacturer tells people who purchase them. And obviously, our team, when we're building products and when we're building software, our focus is on open source software and hardware, free and open source software and hardware. So this begs the obvious question: why do we then use a secure element that's closed source, that's a black box, and that's not as knowable as other systems out there?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a crack at this one first as well. Let's take a step back for a second and just think about all computer chips in general. All computer chips are, or at least all modern computer chips that we would use today in all our different electronic devices, are essentially black boxes. You get a data sheet, and you're told in the data sheet, how to interface with the chip and what the different features of the chip consist of. But there's no such thing today as a modern, high performance, fully open source computer chip. And so, yes, I mean, the secure elements are closed source, but so are the processors that we run, our hardware wallet firmware on. Those are also technically closed source. I think the main difference is not really about open source or closed source. It's about, can I easily find out how to interface with this chip? And more specifically, like, do I need an NDA? Do I need to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the manufacturer of this chip in order to figure out how it works? And, because the secure element world is a little bit more secretive, almost always the manufacturer makes you sign an NDA. And a lot of people, including us, don't like that, right? Because, if you're buying a hardware wallet and you want to go around clicking through all the data sheets of all the parts and chips that are used in the device, like, you should be able to do that without, getting an NDA through the manufacturer. So the chip we use, the microchip 608 series, does have a data sheet that's publicly available. I don't think it's the full data sheet, but it's like most of it. And so that was definitely a plus when we were looking at, that selection for the chip. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to note that pretty much all chips, whether they're, secure elements or processors, are basically closed source black boxes.
Anything else y'all want to add, Q&A or Ken there?
I guess I would just say that, like, that also goes down to the chip level itself, where even if you had a chip design that was, quote unquote open source, like if you take something like RISC-V, that's a step in the right direction. But there's manufacturers of those chips who also have their own intellectual property to build up their own chips, and those all sit on top of the fab's proprietary libraries as well. And so, like, as of today, there's really no path toward a fully open source chip, really all the way down to the chip level, unfortunately.
Yeah, I touched on this during our last Twitter space, but I think the only foundry or fab, as it's called, that offers a fully open source process right now is called Skywater, in collaboration with Google, actually. And it's like a 135 nanometer chip process. And that's a really old chip process. It's probably a couple decades old. I mean, we're at like, 7 nanometers now, even more cutting edge, 5 nanometers, 3 nanometers for stuff like what's in your latest iPhone, a little bit older, like 28 nanometers for, a chip you'd find in a hardware wallet. So, I mean, you're looking at really old chip processes, and they only just started doing this more open source process at this foundry in collaboration with Google in the last, I think, like 18 months or so. And there's only been a handful of tape outs, which means like of production runs for these fully open source chips. So maybe like there's a direction there over time. But definitely as of now, especially if you want to have like any kind of device that offers good performance, you're going to be using, closed source chips. And, that doesn't mean that, that's kind of the state of how things are, but you can still design your hardware and software in a way that, eliminates eliminates putting all your trust into one chip. And so I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about today about, how we do our Passport hardware architecture and how we actually use, this secure element within Passport.
Yeah, I mean that I think is the next thing I wanted to focus on, because if this is a black box and is something that's not open source hardware and not perfectly knowable what it does at the hardware level, how do we go about minimizing the exposure to it while still gaining advantages from it? Because I think that's really the crux of the issue here.
Yeah, maybe I can start at like a higher level and then turn it over to Ken to talk a little bit more detail about the actual implementation. But basically, we use our main processor, which is made by ST Microelectronics, to run our Passport firmware. And the firmware, runs on the processor. The processor is a very popular part. It has a data sheet that's publicly accessible and so on. And then when we're actually going to store the user's seed or the private key, it's not being stored in one place. It's actually we have some data that's stored on the main processor. We have some other data that's stored on the secure element. And then we actually combine it together when you log in and you enter your PIN in and so on and unlock the device. We combine that together in real time to give you your seed. So we're not actually storing your seed on the secure element, and we're not storing the seed on the main processor, which is pretty cool. And then additionally, when we go and when we generate your seed in the first place, we're actually not solely relying on the entropy generated by either chip. We actually have a separate open source circuit on the board that helps, called an avalanche noise source, that gives a really good source of entropy. So we're not relying on any black box component for that. So I'll turn over to Ken to kind of dive into some more of the details there.
Yeah, just to touch a little further on that, we actually combine the avalanche noise source with random numbers from our random data from your element and from the MCU itself. So the MCU has a true random number generator as well. And we combine all those three sources together when we're generating the seed. But yeah, so the benefit of the architecture that Zach described earlier, where we have the two chips involved, is that if you were to pull off the secure element and try and attack it in isolation, the data you're going to get off there is not going to be useful to you. You would also need to isolate the main processor and hack that to get the data off of that. And do so in a way where don't destroy anything in either of the chips, because the combination of the two pieces of data is what allows us to, number one, talk to the secure element. There's what we call a pairing secret, which is used to securely connect to the secure element. And then, like you said, the seed is actually not stored in the slot on the secure element, but by combining it with a one-time pad value that we store in the flash of the internal flash of the processor, we're able to recover the seed when we need to use it for signing.
Yeah, and that combination of the three is really a powerful and important thing for people to understand, because it's not that we're trusting this black box with all of your data, or even just trusting it with your seed entirely. So it really is making the most of the things that this hardware is good at, but not leaving it up to that specific manufacturer and that specific piece of hardware to control your private keys in their entirety. So it's trying to find that best of both worlds.
So for example, the supply chain attack did occur. Let's say there was a Road 608 chip out there that could wirelessly transmit something. The data that it's transmitting would be useless to the receiver because they wouldn't have the one-time pad value to make sense of that data.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really important to note, because one thing that I've seen on Twitter and in the Bitcoin community over the last few months is a a lot of FUD about secure elements and implications that, you know, adding a secure element to your hardware wallet, or that secure elements with hardware wallets are for some reason, like they reduce the security, or, you know, you're adding like closed source stuff to your hardware wallet, or, you know, they could be compromised in some way. And it's so important to realize that, as Ken said, even if they were compromised in some way, it does not actually reduce the security, you know, of your hardware wallet. If anything, it either is no net benefit or a really high net benefit. I would say there's no negative implication of adding a secure element like the way we do on Passport. And, you know, as we also mentioned, every chip is a closed source black box today. And so you really are trusting the chip to run your firmware. And so by breaking apart that trust and using multiple chips, you're actually getting better security.
Agreed there. So we've touched a lot on kind of how we limit the downsides of secure elements, what they are, how they work. But can we dive into a little bit more about what we're actually using them to protect against? So there are these downsides that we talked about. We mitigate them, but what are the benefits, the overwhelming benefits that we think that we get from using secure elements?
Yeah, I can jump in with the high-level stuff here and then let the guys take over. So there's a couple of common or commonly spoken about attacks. The first one we've touched on, which is essentially being able to extract the private key from your device. So having a secure element on your device means that, like the guys have said earlier, that they're going to have to compromise two different chips on the device. They're going to have to, number one, break into your house and grab hold of your device, which is already sort of raises the bar significantly. Then they've got to open the device up without breaking anything, know what they're doing in terms of being able to access the specific chips that we've been talking about, and try to break the structure of them to try and get the secrets out so that they can be combined to then subsequently finally get your private keys out of it. So this is a really, really advanced attack, and it's, you know, your common thief with a big wrench is not going to be able to just turn up to your house and be able to get these secrets out. So devices with secure elements, you know, that's one of the primary use cases is preventing seed extraction for somebody that's got prolonged access to your device. Another one would be what's known as a pin replay attack, which is essentially trying to brute force the pin on the device to gain access to it over and over again. So we use, I believe, our secure element that has a counter on it to count down from 21 for the number of incorrect pin attempts. And after the 21st incorrect pin attempt, the device will be bricked and it's useless to absolutely everybody. I'm sure there's some more finer details that Ken could probably add to that one. The final and more sort of hyper-technical theoretical attack that secure elements can protect against is something called side channel attacks, where somebody again needs physical access to the device, and they use additional data from the device, such as power draw, or even, you know, getting really into the weeds now, where they kind of listen for certain frequencies when certain buttons are pressed, etc., to try and glean certain pieces of information that may help with these advanced attacks to gain an insight about sort of the mechanisms within the device. So those are the three kind of main ones that I'm sort of aware of and that are spoken about frequently.
Yeah, so for Passport, you know, we configure the secure element slots. We talked a bit about this earlier, but this isn't a fully programmable device. It has sort of its set of things that it's able to do, but it does have some ability to reconfigure it to suit, you know, how you want to use it. And one of the features it has is this monotonically increasing counter, which means basically it's a counter that can only go up. And we use that in combination with another slot that has like a number of pin attempts to ensure that, you know, you can't have more than, I think it's 21 login attempts without essentially bricking the device. And the way that works is that if this counter ever reaches this match count, you know, essentially that you've reached 21 attempts, then the slot that is needed to access to just basically generate the secret to read the seed is not available anymore. And so the chip will not let the MCU even read the secret out, or even for that matter, check if the pin is valid anymore. And so that's at a hardware level that's restricted. And that's one of the reasons today that if you do enter your pin too many times incorrectly, the device is essentially, tell you that it's bricked. And that's for your security, right? Like that means that no matter what anyone does, they're not going to be able to access your seed past 21 attempts.
Another thing I just thought of, Ken, is the supply chain protection stuff. I don't think we mentioned that as one of the benefits. So I think that's something that is not many hardware wallets offer the supply chain validation. Can you talk a little bit more about how we do that and how we use the secure element for that?
Yeah, so when you pull your passport out of the box, one of the processes that we take you through is a supply chain validation. And the way that works is there's an HMAC, this hardware message authentication code. Basically, we have a key that's stored inside the secure element, which is not readable and it's not writable. But at configuration time, we're able to install that key in there. And then the secure element is able to receive a challenge, which is essentially just some random message. And it performs a hash. I said hardware earlier. It's hashed message authentication code. It's able to perform a hash inside the secure element and generate the response to the challenge. And that challenge is issued by our server. And then when we respond with the response data, we know that the device that responded had access to that supply chain private key. And essentially, there's no other way to know that value except for there to have been a passport that was configured at our factory, which was able to respond with that challenge. And furthermore, we also do some validation that the message came from our server, because the challenge is also signed with a private key, and the passport firmware has the public key for that to validate that the signature comes from our server. So the combination of the signed request and the challenge and response, which can only be completed by the secure element, is what we're using to prove that the secure element has not been modified in transit, essentially.
Two more quick questions around how we use the secure element. I think one use case that we didn't mention yet is the boot count, which is more of an advanced feature, but is something that's available for you to be able to see how many times the device is booted before you actually enter your PIN, to make sure that nobody slips you a new device that they have malicious firmware on, or something like that, to try to get your PIN and then steal funds later from the real device. That's done with the secure element as well, right?
Yeah. So essentially, this boot counter is just a number that increases every time you turn the device on. So if you were, being targeted by a quote unquote evil mate attack, and you've got somebody keeps turning the device on and trying it out, you would see that boot counter was increasing over time. And so we don't do anything actively to prevent the device from being used, but we do have the ability for you to check that value out anytime you want when you turn on the device. And you can see it's 7 now, but it's been in a drawer for a year, and it was 7, and I turned it on and now it's 12. Like, what the heck? Somebody's been touching this thing. I think right now we only expose that through the bootloader. There's a key you press during boot, which will take you into a screen in the bootloader. And so this is even before the main firmware gets a chance to run. We query the secure element for the boot counter and show it to you.
Awesome. Yeah. There's a lot of different pieces involved for how we can leverage secure elements to bring security in a broad sense with something like Passport. But if we look at other hardware wallets that don't leverage secure elements, what are the benefits that they gain by not using secure elements, and what risks do you see when you consider the different approaches that they're taking?
Just before we get to that, one thing I just remembered we didn't talk about was that we do use the secure elements as well as part of our firmware update mechanism. And part of there's the red and blue light at the top of Passport, and we're using the secure element as far as a mechanism for proving that the firmware is properly signed and that it has not been modified since the last time the device was booted.
Yeah, I'll come in on your previous point, Seth, about other hardware wallets and the benefits or drawbacks of the approaches that other manufacturers have taken around not including a secure element. So a couple that spring to mind would be Trezor, Seed Signer, and I believe Blockstream Jade as well. All operate without a secure element. So I think one of the, don't want to speak for these companies, and I'm not here to kind of bash them. They've all made these choices based on their own merits. But I know that the Trezor guys are quite open about the fact that they didn't include one into their device to ensure that everything, the device is completely open source, and everything on the device is open source, including the chips or lack of a secure element for that matter. Seed Signer takes a different approach where they do not store the seed on the device. They run on general purpose hardware, namely a Raspberry Pi Zero, I believe. So where that the user has to load the seed into the device every time that they use it, which is a benefit from the point of view that if somebody was to gain access to the Seed Signer device and there's no seed on it, then there's nothing to steal. There's no secret and there's no Bitcoin there to be stolen. The fallback from that is that if this is a device that you want to use even remotely, somewhat frequently, then having your seed close by somewhere, somewhat insecure in your house might be a bit of an attack vector. Because especially if it's stored in plain text, somebody who can easily grab hold of that seed and run off with your Bitcoin, doesn't matter whether or not it's stored on a device or not, they've got your plain text seed so they can access everything else. And Blockstream J takes a slightly different, unique approach where I think they do store the seed on the device, but they also, to sign any transactions, they also interface with I think what they call a remote pin server, which by default is ran by Blockstream, but I believe you can run your own as well. So it acts like a quasi 2 of 2 multi-sig where you need some remote party, whether you host that yourself or that's Blockstream, to sign off on any additional transactions. So they gain some of the security or lack of security lost from not having a secure element on there and somebody gaining physical access to your device. They mitigate that somewhat by having a remote pin server. Obviously, the downside of that is that if the remote pin server is down, then you're going to have a pretty hard time signing for your transactions. So lots of different approaches, and I'm sure we're going to see plenty more coming out in the years to come as well, as people try and tackle this self-custody battle in their own different ways and taking many different trade-offs along the way as well.
Yeah, I think that was a really good summary Q&A. I'm pretty biased, but I think that if you don't have a secure element in your hardware wallet, it's just all cons. You lose the physical security, right? As you mentioned, it's pretty common knowledge that if you use a Trezor and you do not use a strong passphrase, then your device is susceptible to just someone stealing it and taking about 15 minutes, about $100 worth of hardware, and breaking into the device and extracting your seed. So Trezor says,
keyword strong passphrase.
Yes, like not like hodl.
You've made that mistake before. I think you mentioned, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, back when I first used a Trezor many years ago, I thought I was really cool keeping some coins on like a passphrase called hodl or something like that. And that's great to segment coins or have plausible deniability. But if someone steals your device, I mean, that could be trivially brute force. So you'd have to have use a password manager or choose 6, seed words at random or something like that if you really want to have a strong passphrase. So like Trezor, you have to do that. As you mentioned, Q&A, I think you summed up kind of the cons of Seed Signer pretty well, where unless you're using it because you're keeping a seed in metal in like a safety deposit box or a vault or something somewhere, if you keep your seed right next to your device, then anyone could just find that seed, and enter it in or scan the QR code of it, and then they have your seed. So It's a really cool project, but I don't think it gives you any kind of physical, security. And then, like you said, with Jade from Blockstream, like it has to connect to a remote PIN server if you want any kind of protection against PIN brute forcing efforts. And so, by adding a secure element into a hardware wallet, you give it really good physical security. Now, of course, all these hardware wallets we mentioned give you good security against remote attackers, right? Against someone, hacking your computer or something like that, because it gives you that secondary screen and a way to verify the transaction from a secondary device. So all of these devices protect against these more remote, software based attacks or hacks. But if you're worried about someone coming, and physically, stealing your hardware wallet or something like that, or whether it's someone or someone who robs your house, or whether it's targeted or so on, you really do need a secure element to give you that kind of physical protection, to give you the ability to rate limit PIN attempts, and to make it so that if they do steal your device, the only way to try to get your seed off of it is to take it to, a lab-based setting, use more sophisticated things like laser attacks and whatnot on expensive equipment that have a high likelihood of actually destroying the chip, probably a higher likelihood of destroying the chip than of actually extracting, any usable data off of it.
Yeah, I think that was a great overview of the things going on with other approaches. And the one thing I would say for Seed Signer is one of the reasons there's not a secure element included there is that wouldn't be a part that's easy for, it's not commodity hardware. So there is another good reason for why they don't include a secure element. But again, important to understand some of the cons that go with that. And just want to reiterate, we're not here to bash the other approaches. There are reasons that these companies have chosen to take different approaches, or these projects have taken different approaches. But important to, again, approach with nuance and understand the pros and the cons of each approach here. The last question for you before we wrap up this segment is just, why do you think that there is this recent increase in FUD against secure elements and against their usage in hardware wallets recently in the Bitcoin space? I feel like there's always something to fight about, especially in bear markets on Bitcoin Twitter, but it seems like there's been kind of a concerted effort across the space to speak out against secure elements. So I'd love to get y'all's thoughts on kind of why you think that is.
I think, obviously we're talking about Bitcoin Twitter here, so there's clearly a tribal aspect to all of this, where people tend to align with different projects. They see the value in a specific project, and they like the trade-offs that the project they're involved with, or that they have grown fond of. They're okay with the trade-offs that they're making, and it's human nature to slowly, the more time you spend time with people or a project or something like that, to align yourself more and more to that, and to kind of get the blinkers on, I guess, if you like, and get a little bit one-track minded, where you think that all of the approaches are bad for reason X. So I think it's worth taking a step back from time to time, and having conversations like this where we talk about the different approaches and understand that no approach is absolutely perfect. Every single approach makes lots of different trade-offs. So it's about, especially with Bitcoin security, it's about making a decision for your Bitcoin security approach that is personal to you. What works for me might not work for somebody else listening to this, based on their technical abilities, or their access to secure locations, or their technical abilities to operate different devices, etc. So definitely no one size fits all. And I think the attitudes or differing approaches and thought processes are just part of the tribal nature of Bitcoin. We're all super passionate about what we really like, and sometimes that spills over, and people like to share their opinions.
Yeah, so a difficulty there where people assume that what's good for them must be good for everybody, and then they just spout off about how all of their approaches are bad because of it. There are, obviously, we talked about there being trade-offs between Trezor and Seed Signer and Jade and Passport and all of them. And you're going to have to look at your situation to decide which trade-offs make sense for you. Like, we think the trade-offs we're making for Passport are probably really good for a large number of people. And that's why we made them. That's why we started the company.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a couple of reasons, maybe just to add to what you both said. One is I think Ledger has given the space a pretty bad reputation in terms of using secure elements or how they use it specifically. Because the way they use is as I alluded to in the beginning of the conversation, is that they run an entirely proprietary closed source security oriented operating system called Bolos um, on the secure element. And so no one knows how that works. It's like a complete black box. And so I think when you think, oh, hardware wallet with secure element, I think often you're thinking Ledger. And I think it may have been one of the reasons why Trezor ended up moving in a anti-secure element direction, is because at one point in time it was really only Ledger or Trezor. So you had the one company that was proprietary closed source, and you had the other company that was more like fully open source. And so I think you have like those are like the very black and white approach, and now you have a lot of nuance. And I think unfortunately the nuance gets lost on places like Twitter. And I also think there's a lack of a lot of the people talking about this on Twitter have shown that they don't have a full understanding of how chips are made. I mean, I keep seeing, secure elements are closed source, and so like don't use them. But as we've talked about, every chip is closed source. So what, are you not supposed to use a processor? A Raspberry Pi has closed source hardware. To boot a Raspberry Pi, you're actually typically using like binary blobs of firmware associated with some of the components on the circuit board. And Raspberry Pi OS is open source, but the actual circuit board schematics and all that kind of stuff are closed. And so there's so much nuance here. And I think that all that nuance is getting lost, unfortunately, in the quick, back and forth spats on Twitter.
Yeah, I heavily agree. I think that combination of the lack of nuance and just Twitter's format natively leads to a lot of one-size-fits-all claims. And I mean, just one of the biggest things that we see happen in the security space and the privacy space and the Bitcoin space is whatever is best for me must be the best for everyone, like Ken said. And I think that's one of my pet peeves in all of those, and something that I've run into a lot in the privacy space specifically is whatever my threat model is, that means that is a threat model that everyone else should have and everyone else should look at. And so I'm going to fight for everyone to follow my threat model. And that I think it's a very detrimental view, and it's one that causes a lot of harm. So people understanding that threat modeling as a whole is something that's very personal. Looking at how you want to secure your Bitcoin is something that's very personal, depending on how much you have, what you care about. It is definitely something where no one else can really prescribe for you. Obviously, people can help you to find out what will fit your use case well, but it's not something that is really one size fits all. Like y'all hit on there. So I think that is another key piece here. Thanks for jumping in for this episode of Journey to Sovereignty, and I hope you'll join us for our next live Twitter space every other Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. GMT. Joining us live gives you a chance to listen in, participate, and get your questions answered on the spot. Follow us at Foundation DVCS on Twitter to keep up with the latest news, get notifications when we go live, and much more. See you at the next one, and thanks for joining us on the Journey to Sovereignty.